Okay, thank you very much for joining me, Stephen. I'm in Prague, you're in Scotland. My first question to you is about your music education. And I'd first like to ask, how was your development as a musician typical of many other classical pianists?
Well, I guess just doing the normal things, learning your pieces. I certainly didn't have any encouragement to improvise or explore different musics, particularly by my teachers. When I was 10, I went to a music school where the teacher was particularly open-minded. It wasn't that he pushed me in the direction of lots of different music or of improvising, but his approach was quite, he sort of encouraged you to find your own way. And so I guess that was probably a bit helpful in terms of branching out a bit. But I would say that basically, certainly my early education, there was nothing unusual about it at all, I don't think.
And so may I ask, did you do all your grades? Or did you just skip plenty?
I skipped some. I skipped grade 2 and I skipped grade 6 and 7.
Right.
I remember it. Funny how you remember these things after all those years. But yeah.
Right. And so the question that follows from that is how was your development perhaps atypical of many professional pianists? I'm interested in all the things that you feel that you learned along the way that weren't taught to you, perhaps.
That led to me improvising, you mean?
And playing by ear, yes.
It's funny, I remember when I was about 16, I played in the premiere of a piece by a composer at the school, and you had to improvise. There was a cadenza. There was 2 pianos and junkyard percussion, and there was a cadenza in it where you had to play as many notes as possible, as loudly as possible, for 2 minutes. That was quite fun. But I remember actually not being able to improvise really. I kind of would take little bits from other pieces and play them very loud, but I didn't sort of have this instinct that I could just do whatever, which seems bizarre now. But around the same time, a bass player at the school who was really into jazz suggested that I listen to some Bill Evans. That was the first jazz I'd ever bought. I just loved the sound world of it and was sort of curious about I think Evans was a very good way in for me because it was so structured and disciplined and tasteful, and yet had this freedom about it as well.
Mm.
So that was the start of exploring it. But then I think a lot of classical musicians have listened to jazz, so I don't know why, in my case, I started to really go with this improvising aspect, like myself. Because, when I was at music college, it was rather actively discouraged. Maybe not across the board, but certainly my teacher there was concerned that it was going to somehow interfere with my playing. She actually sort of strong-armed one of my fellow students to stop playing jazz. He was an amazing jazz player, but he played jazz in a very kind of physical, angular way.
Mm.
And she thought it was interfering with his sort of jeu parler kind of stuff. Yeah, I think there's often a concern that it was going to look weird. It's not what classical players do. Maybe it's self-indulgent, but I loved doing it. So
right.
That feeling was too strong to be kind of put down.
I had this idea that you were improvising from an extremely early age.
Oh no. Trying to think how it really started. I mean, listening to jazz was a start, but I wasn't improvising immediately. Oh well, that same friend who gave me some transcriptions of Bill Evans. That was probably the first time I explored at all improvising, just sort of slightly messing around with the transcriptions.
Mm. How about playing by ear? Is that something that you did quite naturally from an early age?
Yeah, well, I had a very good ear. I could, I started playing very young. I had perfect pitch, but also there was this very strong connection between the sound of something and the feel of it in my fingers. Like if I heard a chord I could immediately name the notes, but also almost quicker, I could feel what it felt like to play the chord.
Right.
Somehow, almost like a kind of synesthesia. It like it bypassed any analytical process, and I still have that to an extent. So that was a useful skill for improvising. Being able to hear something in your head and immediately know what it feels like at the instrument. But it still doesn't quite explain it, because you still need to have the impetus to, like, there's something you want to say. It's really hard to say where that comes from.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe, is it enough to say that there is just this instinctive need to express ourselves, and that not expressing ourselves in music is actually the unnatural state, and that when the door is opened a little bit and you find the pleasure of doing something that feels like it expresses you, there's this great pleasure associated with it, and then naturally you go with it.
One of the ideas that I'm toying with is that everybody potentially has the ability to push through this door and experience that world. For some reasons, maybe some innate talent, but maybe circumstances as well. You were able to move into that realm, and perhaps others would have that ability too.
I'm sure that's true, because, I mean, isn't it almost an exact analogy with using language? I mean, what's the difference? The difference really is how we're socialized, is that the right word? How we're encouraged to think about these things, and we're encouraged.
I think that some people are scintillating conversationalists, and other people aren't. But that's all quite normal, and we don't hold that against anybody.
Yeah.
But some people are constantly making jokes, or humor, perhaps. Some people's sense of humor is a kind of improvisation.
Yeah, but the suggestion that, oh, well, I can't use my own words, like saying hello to someone, because as if you can be put on the spot, is the almost direct analogy with, well, I can't muck about because there might be something wrong with it. I mean, it's sort of nonsensical when you think about it. But yeah, I don't know, this sort of kind of well, actually, it's very bizarre, given that improvisation is a completely integral part of the classical music tradition, back in Beethoven, Brahms's time. And now we are the aberration that we don't automatically improvise and experiment. Although happily it's starting to come back, I think. Like, music colleges are starting to teach it more. So I think the pendulum's swinging back.
Onto your performing, is there any difference for you between the states of performing and improvising?
There's probably 2 or 3 concerts in my life when I felt really completely relaxed. And in those concerts, it feels very much like improvising. But whenever there's a sort of self-consciousness, well, the truth is you can feel self-conscious improvising as well. But the times when I've improvised and I start to sort of basically relaxed, then it happens incredibly easily. So that's quite difficult to get to in playing classical stuff, just because physically it's very difficult. It's very easy to be self-conscious. But there's also a sort of different relationship to the audience somehow, improvising. It's hard to put into words, really.
I mean, in a classical performance, the audience generally knows, well, many of them will know what to expect, what's coming up, in terms of, the notes and the rhythms and a lot of the music.
Yeah.
Whereas with improvisation, there is this unknown. Everyone's very, very aware that they're all standing on the edge of something.
Yeah, the thing that I'm most aware of is there's a greater relaxation in my body improvising in a concert. And you feel your relationship to the audience is different. Probably what you were saying, like they don't know what's coming. It feels more informal somehow, which is maybe natural. I mean, improvising and playing exactly what's coming from you, there is one less barrier. Even though classical music, you can express things very deeply, but it's still one step removed from you, and you're kind of filtering your feelings through this other thing.
Would you say that there are some classical repertoires that are nearer to the state of improvisation than others?
Oh, yeah. I mean, a lot of the romantic repertoire, particularly someone like Liszt, I mean, so much of the improvisation is kind of clearly written into the piece. So you somehow have to make that sound like you're making it up. Beethoven, obviously. You know, I suspect if we were able to go back and listen to the composers play their own pieces, we'd be shocked how much was different from what was written in the scores. Certainly with Beethoven. You know, there's this great story. There's this story which is often used to justify people not improvising, that Beethoven heard Czerny play his Quintet for Piano and Wind, and Czerny did this cadenza in the middle of it, which wasn't in the score, and Beethoven was furious and said, "You've got to play it exactly as it's written." So that's kind of been handed down as holy writ. We have to play exactly what's written. But Beethoven, playing the same piece, I think it was some years later, did this enormous cadenza in the middle. Like, it lasted so long, like the players just didn't know what to do. They're sitting there, the other players. So, I mean, the music isn't somehow set in stone in the way that we have been taught, you know, in the 20th century. There was much more inherent freedom to it. And probably with that Beethoven story, he was probably just really irritated that Czerny didn't do it very well, you know, and kind of made it sound bad. I mean, Czerny himself said it was very tasteless, what he had done, he recognized.
Right.
So, I don't know, there's this, it's like a kind of ossification of things, you know, something that was full of life has become completely dried out, or there's a danger it becomes really dried out, like a museum piece rather than something that really is sort of vital and alive.
How about when you're playing in different kinds of ensembles? Are there different, like, for example, does a duo feel more improvisatory in some way?
Than playing solo?
Well, than playing in an orchestra, for example, or...
Oh, it's very hard in orchestra to get that improvisational sense. One of the very few conductors I've seen that can do that's Yannick Nézi-Séguin. Like, something about the way he moves, you can tell he's really intimately connecting to what the orchestra is doing and sort of pulling them with him. But I think that's really unusual. Duos are sort of ideal in a way, because the more people there are, the more difficult it is to have that freedom. But if you're on your own, you know, you're not surprised. I mean, you can be surprised, but not in the way that if you have a different musical mind, doing things which might be radically different from what you expect. But then you have to line up enough that you can kind of follow each other. You know, if you've got completely different instincts, then where the other person takes you, you really don't want to go sometimes. And so that's kind of awkward. You know.
Right. At the top level of classical pianists, what sort of differences do you perceive between the players, without mentioning any names, of course? Are there continuums along which you might place famous pianists?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, gosh, I had to put it into words. There's quite a difference in terms of how much people let go and how much they try and control what they're doing, which is also, I think, connected to how important it is to someone to pay attention to the details of a score. It doesn't completely line up. You can pay a lot of attention to what's in the score, but also be quite free. But it tends to be that people that are obsessed with the details of the score are also people that are kind of controlled. So you could put Brendel more kind of at that end of the spectrum, for example. But what he does is incredible, because he uses the detail of the score to find so much character and so much internal life in the music. But it's different from someone like Martha Argerich, who's probably not so obsessed with that and just sort of bursts out emotionally in what she's doing. And that's thrilling in a different way. To find someone that can strongly inhabit both of those extremes, like kind of completely open and yet also paying attention to the details. Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. What's more important? I mean, to me, it's obviously important that something is visceral. That's the most important thing, that something speaks directly. And this sort of obsession with the score can be constricting to that, but it can also help it in a way if you use it in the right way. So that's one continuum, I would say. Gosh, what else? I mean, there's questions of how much a performer wants the music to sound like them. How. I mean, it's actually related to the last question, how much you pay attention to the score. An easy way to give life to a piece of music is just to sort of unthinkingly pour your own emotional biases into it. For example, I like contrast. I like playing very loud and very quiet. So, unthinkingly, I could take a Haydn sonata and have PPPs and triple fortes. And it would be very likely that would upset the emotional balance of the piece. Whereas if it's for a composer like Messiaen, it would be those biases would suit the music extremely well. So the kind of a challenge for the performer is like, okay, how do you take those instinctive urges and then channel them in a way which brings the music to life rather than sort of not flattens it, but rather than overrides what the composer is trying to do.
Right.
But even that, you can't say what the composer is trying to do because there's no one thing the composer is trying to do. I mean, the composer might have their view of what the music should be like, but they can't dictate that to the performer. Every person will find their own emotional meaning in the piece. And actually, that's one other thing which can differ from performer to performer, is this sort of philosophical sense of, is there a right way a piece should go, or is it something personal? It might seem like a slightly odd way of putting it, but there are performers who have sort of explicitly said, it's about playing the piece in the right way, not the wrong way. Well, there was a funny story about somebody. I know this piano tuner who lived in Manchester, and he heard the same performer play the same Mozart concerto a few years apart. And he's a very good musician, this tuner, and he noticed that the interpretation was quite different. And he asked the pianist about it afterwards. It's really difficult, different this time. And the pianist said, "Oh yes, before I was wrong."
Oh.
And so that, in a way, that's a really significant issue for teachers, because often with teachers, they're sort of telling students all the things that are wrong. I mean, sure, fine, technique and sound production stuff, you can point at things that aren't helping, but it often spills over into interpretative things. That's the wrong way of doing that phrase. This is how it should go. Sounds a bit preposterous, but it actually happens fairly often.
And some of the pieces that you've played many times over the years, how has your interpretation changed, or has it?
Yeah, but I'm not somebody that generally fundamentally rethinks what I do. It's more that it sort of develops incrementally. I mean, you get someone like, again, Brendel. I mean, for me, he's like one of the really greatest. I've learned more from Brendel than probably anyone. And he would, he's got like Schubert and Beethoven sonata cycles more than one, and you can tell that in the next second iteration, like there's been a kind of profound rethink. Somehow, I'm not so interested in that because my focus is on learning lots and lots and lots of repertoire. I'm kind of really voracious, like wanting to learn as much as possible. So I'm not, certainly not at the moment. I don't have this instinct to sort of really go back over old stuff and finally rework it. So it means when I come to play like Schubert B-flat sonata, let's say, which is one of the pieces I've played most, it's like putting on a really comfortable pair of shoes. And just as you get older, things naturally change. I mean, I'm a bit less uptight in performing, so automatically that opens things up a bit. I'm a bit less, how would you say it? I've always had this tendency to play too fast. Because things always sound faster than you think they're going to. So as I get older, I sort of increasingly recognize that weird sort of acoustical phenomenon, and so I compensate for that. I mean, that's quite in a way a banal example. I think my playing has become more visceral, sort of more emotionally engaged.
Right.
again, it's just a question of growing up, not a sort of particularly grand plan.
Mm. I'd like to move on now to a bit more about playing by ear and improvising. You've had perfect pitch for as long as you can remember. What is your experience of perfect pitch, and what do you imagine that life without perfect pitch might be? It's very difficult to answer that.
It's like trying to describe what red looks like. I don't know.
Or it's asking a fish the definition of water.
Yeah, it's sort of, well, like I say, like for me, there's this almost immediate correspondence between the sound and the feel, the physical feel. I think that's not quite as strong as it used to be, but when I was younger, like you took play a chord and then absolutely immediately I would know like these fingers and like that organization. So yeah, it's just something completely instinctive. And what things would be like without it? Okay, I mean, honestly, I don't think things would be much different without it. It's very helpful for improvising. But in terms of one's experience of music, it's not really very relevant, actually, I don't think. Because music's all about the feeling. You'll still have the feeling without the perfect pitch.
I remember once in Manchester, you said to me that you don't understand how people can improvise without perfect pitch. And you said this in a joking way.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a really big help, particularly if you're improvising with other people. And they play something, who knows where in the musical spectrum, and you're sort of trying to latch onto it. Very, very helpful to know without thinking, okay, that's F sharp or whatever, and then you can really take it on. But having said that, I suppose you can just play a note that's in the area, and then you very quickly know, okay, so all right, it's around there, and the audience doesn't know what you're trying to do, so people just sort of take what's given to them in a way, unless it's some crashingly inappropriate note, which is probably not that likely, depending on the kind of improvisation.
But if you can, I mean, if you have good relative pitch, and you know the key center that you're in, it's there are other ways of knowing what the note is. Yeah. And do you think that many of the great jazz improvisers, for example, had incredible ears in terms of being able to copy phrases out of the air?
Yeah, that's probably more a question of relative pitch. I honestly don't know. I've not thought about it. Because it's not actually a massively important skill, I don't think, in jazz, is it? That sort of copying. I mean, you get this sort of trading eights or whatever, and you can have these cute little correspondences, but it's more about your own sense of how you build a solo up, I think, in jazz.
Have you appreciated playing by ear and improvising as a musician, and how have they brought you joy? Well, I mean, I think the most fulfilling things I've done in music have been improvising, probably. It's just there's a different level of engagement I found with what you're doing when you're really relaxed, and when the ideas come to you unbidden, and you land on something which really feels like it's meaningful and it's come from you. It's an absolutely incredible feeling. And again, I mean, it's not impossible to get that in classical music, but it's harder. I mean, the great thing about classical music, of course, is that is this amazing distillation of feeling, like in the great pieces, and a kind of concentration of emotion and structure, and the combination of those in a way which I would never ever be able to even approach improvising. But the trade-off when you're improvising is it is so personal, and the engagement that gives is a different kind of drug, you could say. Like it's something. I think improvising helped my classical playing enormously. Just getting that sense of engagement with what I was doing, and I mean, in the banal terms, it made me realize I started to see all over the place in the musical scores where there was elements of improvisation that I hadn't really noticed before. And then you get the sense that for the composer, the piece isn't set in stone, but that
almost like you can imagine them writing it, and maybe even at the beginning they don't know what's going to happen. There's something speculative, and then it lands on this melody, and it goes on, and then there's some interruption, and then it becomes more of a drama in the way that you feel when you're improvising. How am I going to start? There's this kind of silence. You're aware of what you feel. Maybe some melodic idea just jumps into your head, or maybe you have some sense of a chord, and then you follow whatever's happening for a while, and then you have this instinct. Okay, so it has to move somewhere else now. So that whole kind of ebb and flow you feel when you're improvising. Getting a lot of experience of that really helped to find that in classical pieces.
Can you describe what is going on for you as you improvise? And do you have a sense of where the ideas are coming from?
Honestly, I don't hold myself up as any great improviser. I think it's quite limited what I do. And let's see, when I'm relaxed. So what was the first bit of the question again?
Can you describe what is going on for you?
What's going on when I'm improvising? So when I'm relaxed. So this is the thing, like when I only improvise well when I'm relaxed. So if I'm thinking about classical playing, when I'm not relaxed, I can still play well because I've got this breadth of experience behind me, and I've worked very hard to get control of these various aspects of the music, and so it still works. When I'm not relaxed improvising, I don't have any of that background, so it kind of very quickly dries up. So that's the kind of proviso, because it means it's quite a limited picture of improvising, I think, what I would give. But when I'm relaxed, I don't really think much. There seems to be this natural sense of the flow of the music. I'm not worried about things that might not fit, because somehow everything seems to fit in some way. Wrong notes doesn't seem to even be particularly an issue. Not that everything sounds lovely, but just anything which happens which is somehow surprising immediately leads to something else. So it feels like a very natural process. And the second bit of the question was?
Well, where do the ideas come from?
Where do the ideas come from? That's a great question.
I've got this idea that improvising is a little bit like surfing, and the waves just come, and in one sense, you just try and stay on the wave and play the ideas that are coming.
Part of me thinks it's not so different from just, where do the words come from when you ask me a question? There's this upsurge of something, thought, there's experience behind it. It's not a perfect analogy because obviously it's in response to something. A better analogy might be giving an improvised soliloquy about who knows what. Where would the words come from that? Maybe it'd be like you just start talking about how you feel and your experience of that day or whatever, or where you are in your life. I think in the end, like when these things work, it's always it always has feeling underneath it. Those are the things which are satisfying, and those are the things which communicate to a listener, I think. So in terms of where the ideas come from, it feels to me the feelings, whatever feelings are there under the surface when you're playing, there are these kind of analogies in music. Like if you're, let's say you're feeling angry for whatever reason, it makes your body feel a certain way, the kind of solidity maybe, and it suggests certain kind of stabbing chords, let's say, something like that, or certainly suggests things that are probably loud, unless it's this really suppressed anger, harder to play. So it's not that it's a question, it's not that it's a process of analysis. Oh, I feel angry, therefore this would be something that fits it. It's more that whatever you're feeling, there's there are certain musical areas that it would suggest that if you're relaxed, naturally the connections naturally happen, I think.
Right.
If that makes sense. And so that's why when I'm not relaxed, I really don't improvise well at all, because I don't have this sort of background of experience of playing hundreds of concerts, improvising, and finding all these things I can fall back on when I'm not feeling inspired, so to say.
So did you used to improvise more in your concerts, and are you improvising less at the moment, or do you think it's something that will come back?
I don't know. I'm improvising much less now. It was partly that it started to feel like a bit of a parlor trick. That I could feel my classical playing was getting better and better. My improvising wasn't. And I don't know. It just it didn't fit anymore.
Right.
And I do little bits myself, kind of muck around with it, but it doesn't feel like it. It feels limited.
Right.
And for whatever reason, I've not felt the need to really try and develop it.
Who are some of your favorite improvisers? Yeah.
Certainly Keith Jarrett, Bill Evans. I mean, Jarrett, I think I learned a lot from in terms of that kind of rather radical openness. And so just all those solo concerts and literally see what happens, and, you know, it doesn't always work. But, well, it's funny, I saw one of his concerts in London maybe 5 years ago. And I would say that, you know, 80% of that concert was fine. You know, not particularly special, but there were 5 minutes of that concert that I'll never forget. It was one of the most beautiful things I had ever heard.
Mm.
So it's worth it for those 5 minutes. You know, he doesn't always hit gold, but when he hits it, he really hits it. Who else? Keith Tippett, I really love. Really, just this completely original musical language, and with such conviction in it. John Taylor. I mean, a whole bunch of obvious people: Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Trilok Gurtu. All those amazing sort of percussion cadenzas and stuff.
The final section I've got here is to do with music education. Do you think that playing by ear and improvisation are skills that can be taught in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fundamental thing is just giving people permission to do it. And I think people often think it's difficult to do because there's years of implicit messages that you can't do this. You know, or you have to play what the composer's written, you have to play it exactly as it's written. It's like you've got no freedom at all. It's sort of the underlying message, even if sometimes people talk about, well, you have to express yourself in the music. And I think that's for some musicians, actually, in a way, the more talent, the more adept a musician is, the more developed, the harder it can be to get that message across, because it feels like there's more to lose. You know, you're playing extremely well now, and now you're going to sound like an idiot for just sort of messing around. Yeah, so it's a really important thing to be said early. You know, it's like the most natural thing a musician could do: put a baby in front of a piano and it's banging away and loving it. I mean, in terms of like how you teach it, I think it's such an enormous area. It's like, how do you teach writing? There's so many possible avenues it could go in. So I think when somebody feels they have permission to do it, then naturally they start exploring. Oh, I really like modal music, and so you're sort of fiddling about with modes, or I like loud crashing music, and you do that, or whatever. You know, I don't know how you would teach it. Actually, I did teach an improvisation course at University of Connecticut. Just sort of try to open up various possible areas for people to explore, but I have no idea how helpful it was.
Well, my final question is you've touched on this already. I mean, what is missing from traditional methods of teaching within classical music, or what you've talked about? You know, too much attention to the score early on. You know, all the right notes.
Yeah, so it's a really tricky thing, because I'm sort of nervous even to say it's like too much attention to the score. It's more like paying attention to the score is extremely important, but it's more the counterweight rather, that sort of says, okay, the score is important, but what you feel instinctively is very important as well. And so those things come into conflict fairly often, actually. And traditionally, the approach has been, well, the score's got to win. And I think that's rubbish. You know, it has to, there's a weighing of how do you honor what's there and how do you honor what's in you as well. For me, the fundamental thing which has often been missing is that it's the goal of the student to find their own interpretation, like simply put. And people will say that, but I don't know how to put this into words. It's a sort of subtle thing. I mean, the fundamental thing is that there is no right way to play a piece of music, and teachers can be quite dogmatic. But you know, right and wrong, and I think a better way of putting it is, I think traditionally there's been a certain lack of curiosity about why a student wants to play a certain way, and a tendency to say, oh no, that's wrong. It should sound like this. That's too slow. That's too fast, too loud, too quiet, whatever it is. Rather than trying to get at what it is the student's trying to do and then helping the student to find a better way of doing that. It's not that no teachers teach like that, but in my experience, it's rare. And I think it goes along with this obsession with the sort of score and this sort of sense of, you know, us having to do the right thing. And I think that really closes off people's experience of music. It sort of limits it greatly because you don't feel like you're able to properly inhabit it. And the older I've got, the less I've cared about the detail in the score, even though I still pay a lot of attention to it. Like the first thing I pay attention to is just this sort of feeling in my body. You know, when I'm playing this piece of music, what does it make me feel like? What does it make me feel I want to express? And then I try and connect that to what's there in the score. Or rather, the two things happen at the same time. And I think it's a terrible loss when you don't have that visceral engagement, because that's where all the pleasure comes from. It's sort of, you know, pleasure's in your body. It's not in your head. And the pleasure in music's in your body. And so I think encouraging people to find ways of, I mean, sorry, it's sort of a long answer, but it's such a big subject. It's a really important subject. You know, how it doesn't just happen by itself. Yeah, oh, this music feels like this to me. Because particularly when you have these years of that instinct being trampled, you know, it's like a muscle that's not developed. And so, I mean, with students, I often talk about, encourage them to think about ways of getting deeper into the music for themselves, whether it be singing it out loud, singing it in their head, looking at the structure of it, finding ways of sort of settling into the music, which is I don't know, again, it's hard to put into words. I mean, it's something that feels so obvious when you have it. And I've spent years and years developing these things. And so now it feels like a very easy process, mostly. That very quickly I know what I want to do with a piece of music. It feels very vivid and alive. But I remember for long periods trying to develop that and really not being sure what to do, like sort of, do I do like this or that? And then really spending time with these various different strategies of trying to find, how do I sink into the music? How do I feel it more instinctively? Actually, moving was one of the best ways I found of doing that. Singing the music and moving around the room. It's like a way of getting into your body better. How does your body want to move when you're singing this music? Or just singing it in your head, maybe. And then again, it's like that ebb and flow. It helps you feel the sort of natural movement. And so it's a huge topic, and it's one that I've hardly ever heard talked about by teachers. So to come back to your question, I don't know how you'd encapsulate all that in a few words, but how students can get it into their bodies so that it's something that really feels alive in them, rather than 100 instructions about going faster at this point and playing that note quieter and, you know, all of that.
Things like games that the teacher can play with the student at the piano, for example, like playing a half a phrase, and then the students, you know, singing an answer phrase and then playing an answer phrase. Those sorts of things. Do you think that's quite common in classical teaching? Nobody
ever did that with me.
But you would have found it fun, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah, I think it's a great idea. I have done things with students where in that improvisation course that I taught, I would there was a game that I really liked where you sort of just improvise something with atonal and completely free, and you try and get the other person to copy you as absolutely closely as they can. So not the notes, just the gestures, and making it very varied, so they have to be listening very, very closely. And so to them, it's sort of like half improvising. They're having to make the notes up, but they're piggybacking on what I'm doing. And then when after a little while, it's like you've sort of fooled them into improvising a bit, and then you just say, okay, so now you do it, and I'll copy you, and then hopefully they've just gotten self-conscious enough that they can then start doing bits and bobs. And it's a very simple, natural thing, and that's really fun because you're sort of trying to catch each other out, and yeah, I think those kind of things are great. It sort of makes it demystifies it a bit.
The Beethoven Third Piano Concerto was like from the age of 11. My mum had a few cassettes we listened to in the Middle East, and the second and third piano concerto, I just know like the back of my hand. I can sing every single note.
Yeah,
I just love the cadenza of the third concerto, the first movement.
Yeah, that is one of maybe the best cadenza he wrote, I think.
It's just this one point. It's just, and I haven't got a perfect picture. I don't know if I'm singing it. It's just dum dum bum bum bum.
Yeah,
bum,
exactly.
And it's just like, you can't get any more. Just it's just.
Yeah, what a genius! That's my favorite moment. It's like so head banging. Yeah. Anyway. It's funny. I gave a talk on improvisation at St Mary's Music School, and the next day I was playing that concerto at the Usher Hall, and the kids came along, and I'd been taught, like, one of the things I talked about was sort of cadenzas, maybe writing your own cadenzas and stuff, and this very spirited cellist said to me, "God, did you write that cadenza yourself?" I said, "No, it's Beethoven." She said, "Hypocrite." But it's too good not to play.
Thank you so much. It's hugely appreciated.
No, you're welcome.
All right.
Go.
Take care.
I see you, Jerry.
Bye.
Bye.